I do. I do want to be a part of building this house of love with you. I do. I'm going to tell you a story about me and Unitarian Universalism. I love Unitarian Universalism deeply and to the core of my being. And my love for Unitarian Universalism came on kind of like first love does. And I read the principles when I was 20 years old. I read these principles for the first time of Unitarian Universalism on Wikipedia in my dorm room at 2 a.m. These principles described things I already believed. How could there be a religion that I could already subscribe to? I was in shock, yes, and in love. Now, before I go on, it's quiz time. Can any person here, in person or online, name any of the principles without looking it up or looking in your hymnal? All right, so raise your hand if you're here, and Therese will bring the microphone to you, or you can raise your hand. It looks like somebody raised their hand online. So looks like Stacy Gilchrist. Should we be able to, can we be able to hear her? You need to unmute Stacy. So.
Oh, good, okay. Yes, so believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person.
Yes, that's right. Well done. Any others that anyone can name? Oh, somebody back there looks like Caitlin.
Respect for the interdependent web of life. That's a paraphrase.
Close enough. Respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. The seventh principle, which was added in 1987. Well done. Anyone else? You can paraphrase. We will accept that. You have another one over here? Okay. You have to unmute, Heather.
Sorry, I typed it. It's the free and responsible search for truth and meaning.
Very nice. Exactly correct. We will accept the fact that you work for Unitarian Universalist organization, but the McDonald family.
The right of conscience and the democratic process.
Can't quite hear you. I think that was Carrie. I can't quite hear you.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
The right of conscience and the use of the democratic process.
Yes, so that's right. The right of conscience and the use of democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. Also works for the UUA, but we'll accept it. Who's next? Bill over here.
Equity, injustice, and compassion in human relations.
Well done. I'm thoroughly impressed. You guys are doing better than I expected. We still have two more. Anyone? Okay. Aisha, did you look at your hymnal? I saw it. Oh, I saw it on your left.
I am cheating because I had looked at the hymnal while you were doing the presentation up there. But I had forgotten the goal of justice, global justice and equality for all people.
The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all? Absolutely. We'll accept it. One more. Anyone else? I should have had prizes. I am thoroughly impressed. Okay, so Brian.
We totally lost track and I can't remember. I only remember the song version, but it's each person is worthwhile, right? Is that the last one? You did that one.
Yeah, I think that's probably the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Yeah. Okay, so the one we missed was acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. So that was good. I definitely could not name all the principles. Congratulations. Yeah, very impressed. So as I was saying, I fell in love with these principles, but even more than that, I fell in love with the fact that they could be changed. This was mind-blowing to me in a world that is so focused on scripture, from the Bible to the Constitution. To have a living faith with a living document is truly radical and revolutionary. And it's vitally important to our faith. Being able to see that we need an extra principle is so deeply important that adding the principle, the seventh principle about the web of life, of which we were all a part, not centering only on humans, but also on our world, as we do in the first principle, that was deeply needed and vitally important to our faith. And it fits so perfectly among all the other 7 principles. It feels like it was always there. So if you're missing these, you can look them up in the hymnal or online if you Google 7 principles UU. If you are relatively new to Unitarian Universalism, and most of us here are, because perhaps we came as adults, or because it's honestly kind of a new religion, it can be easy to stay focused on these 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism, as if they are our own version of a creed, but they are not. They are not unchanging, they are fluid, and they are prescriptions for our world that we dream about building. And our faith, just like our congregations and our own convictions, can change, should change to reflect new beliefs and knowledge. Our principle, the free and responsible search for truth and wisdom and meaning, fundamentally means that we have to be responsible for what we learn and how it changes us, and perhaps how it changes our faith in return. So after all that, what is this proposed 8th principle? Because this is what I want to talk about today. It's a principle that has been proposed to add to our shared set of values. When you hear or read our list of principles, is anything missing? The proposed principle states, and I'm not going to quiz you on this one, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. This principle came about thanks to years, perhaps decades of work on creating deep multicultural communities in Unitarian Universalism. A woman named Paula Cole-Jones, the former director of racial and social justice of the Mid-Atlantic District of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, of which our church is a member, noticed that many Unitarian Universalists felt that they could be good UUs by simply following the 7 principles and never thinking about the impacts of racism on their lives and their world. She and a man named Bruce Pollock Johnson came up with a draft of this principle in 2013, and it was workshopped by anti-racists in their district to fill the need that they saw in our principles. They found that most Unitarian Universalist congregations were primarily European American, not only in their attendance, but also in their culture, especially their music, leadership, and involvement with other organizations. The history of our faith traditions tells us that Unitarian Universalists have been involved in things like the civil rights movement and the abolition of slavery. Whew, I'm running out of breath preaching with this mask on. We have also had many members, despite this fact, who were slaveholders, and a history that is tied to white supremacy again and again. The idea that we should have an 8th principle to address this is a natural progression of this knowledge, and the idea that we've learned more, especially those of us who are white, about how racism and white supremacy is embedded so much in our culture, both inside and outside the church. This principle is a way for us to use the truth and meaning we've discovered responsibly. Over the past 5 to 10 years, the Black Lives Matter movement has caused a lot of people, a lot of white people, to do what Martin Luther King Jr. asked a bunch of Unitarian Universalists to do at a speech he gave at a Unitarian Universalist General Assembly. He said, "Don't sleep through the revolution." So think about it. If you are white, or even if you're not, have you learned a thing or two about racism over the past few years? About how much it impacts our lives and our institutions? I know I have. I have been alarmed at the ever-expanding connections that I see between slavery and our current system of white supremacy, by white colonialism and its continued oppression around the world. I've been more and more convinced that the ideals of which this country was founded upon have never been lived up to because of the sheer atrocity of this genocide. I've seen the ways in which Black folks are treated in this country. After George Floyd was murdered, I called my friend Sean, a Black man I love who loves me, and he said, "Man, all my white friends keep asking me if I'm okay, but like, why this guy? It's not like there wasn't a Black man killed last week. But if that's what makes you care, fine." So yes, my learning isn't some kind of badge of honor. It's the peeling away of layers and layers of social conditioning that taught me things like, if you don't have a job, it's because you're lazy. If people are in jail, they must have done something to deserve it. Those with wealth deserve it, and the police will always look out for everyone's best interests. All of which have deeply different resonance depending on your race. It's been coming to this realization that literally nothing in my life is without a layer of racial understanding on top of it. Something people of color know from the moment they can see the differences between themselves and the dominant culture. As my friend Sean has asked me over and over again, when did you realize you were white? Of course, my journey with racial identity is not synonymous with the church's journey towards or away from multiculturalism and the beloved community. So let's think deeply in some of the ways in which this church's history and present align with this white supremacist culture we live in. Quick history. What happened in 1648? Anyone? Jamie. First parish in Malden was founded. Why? Let's turn to our church history book that was written on our 325th anniversary in 1974. And we're going to hit our 375th soon, which we'll actually talk about later. And the very first words of this narrative are the first white men who viewed the territory in the north of the Mystic River were probably the Sprague brothers of Salem. The words go on to explain a group of men who began to live in this region, attending church in Charlestown, organizing, and they considered this a long and dangerous journey to go to church. They organized themselves into a church in 1648. Then they became the town of Malden in 1649. It says, the first parish in the town became one and remained so for many years. Despite our own history, yet in our own history, despite this oblique reference to white men in the first sentence, it says nothing of the other people who lived in this area. What I've been able to find is that the land was purchased from the Pennacook, but we all know that that wasn't exactly how things went in many areas of New England at the time. According to one source, 75% of the Pennacook were killed in the mid-17th century due to smallpox and other illnesses. Though they initially had a formal alliance with the colonists, the colonists eventually grew suspicious of indigenous people in the area, including the Pennacook. And their chief, Passaconaway's son, Wallalancet, was captured and held for 2 years, causing Passaconaway to submit to a treaty of submission to Massachusetts. And this was all happening during the time that Malden and First Parish in Malden were being established on land purchased from this tribe. Now, this Pennacook tribe doesn't really even exist anymore. They become part of the Abenaki in New York. But I wonder, what is our duty to them? How have we, all these years later, benefited from this so-called purchase of land? And of course, there's more. Slavery wasn't outlawed in Massachusetts until 1780. So that's over 100 years that our church operated in this land of slavery. And so there was no doubt, as we were the only church in Malden at the time, slaveholders were among our membership. And I've been doing some research on this and have so far found 9 slaveholders and 11 enslaved people with Malden addresses during that period. State-sanctioned religion didn't end until around 1800 in Massachusetts, meaning there was no doubt that some of these people were among our members. Now, add to that our history as a white church and all the ways white families have benefited financially from slavery, from accumulation of wealth, from redlining. And it's not hard to see that our building, built in 1907, dates, okay, and very expensive, and our almost $3 million endowment were largely a result of substantial white privilege and white supremacy, and even possibly slavery and the genocide of indigenous people. Now, I know what I'm saying is intense, but none of it is untrue, and it may not be the fault of you, the people sitting in these pews or listening online, but we are benefiting from it. But it is also true that today we are trying to fix this as much as we can. We are opening our building to the wider community. We are examining these questions of our history. We are giving money to folks who are in need in our community. We are a beacon for queer people, family, we've supported immigrants, and we know we can do more. But as we learn more, we need to reflect, like the Unitarian Universalist faith as a whole, and who we are called to be in these times. Are we called to be a church that sits on its proverbial hill with a banner claiming Black Lives Matter outside, but no real transformation inside? Or are we a church that will truly examine our history, our present, and live into that beloved community of Dr. King's vision for a different world, one that our spiritual ancestors have helped create? We cannot undo the past, but we have learned enough to know that we can change the present, that we can transform who we are, so that we can transform our world and our future. Racism and other oppressions are an important part of this, recognizing them. And through our living tradition, our traditions that allow us to create new principles, new visions of our world, shouldn't we realize that the time has come that we have learned enough to know that we must spell this out? Of course, a principle is not a charge of action. It does not mean that we magically get rid of what's come before, but it calls us to work to change it, just as hard as we work to honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person and the web of life of which we live. So too, we can recognize and dismantle systems of racism and oppressions and create that beloved community here and in all our institutions. Over 50 congregations have adopted this principle already, and at some point, the Unitarian Universalist Association will vote on it, and I believe it will be adopted. And the question I have for us is, will we? I want to build this house of love together. Do you? I know you do. We hold each other in love. We will continue that love in this future, yet unknown to us. Blessed be, and let us stay together. Amen. Amen.